that, he'd installed an alarm system inside of the house that would contact the local authorities in the unlikely event of an emergency. And to further their peace of mind, Kimberly had also made an agreement with one of their neighbors, promising to keep an eye on each other's property. Although, due to the town's low crime rate, the idea that residents of Trow Road could be targeted victims of crime was never considered. Before David left for his trip on Saturday, October 3rd, 2009, the house's alarm system had unexpectedly malfunctioned, rendering it inoperable. Despite this, the family remained unconcerned. But as David walked out that door for yet another work trip, he couldn't have ever imagined that the world he knew was about to be tragically ripped away from him. It was another typical weekend for the mother-daughter duo, where they made plans to shop at their local mall the next day and possibly stop by Jamie's karate studio. At least, that's what Kimberly had messaged to David before she and Jamie went to bed around 8:30. Jamie would often sleep in her parents' bedroom while David was gone, and this weekend was no different. From the hotel in Maryland, David messaged his family a good night. Around 4 in the morning on October 4th, 2009, a chilling 911 call was made to a local dispatcher. The voice was that of a little girl, soft and quiet and very hard to hear. But what the dispatcher could make out was the whimpering cries of a terrified child begging for help. Unable to gain a clear understanding of what the little girl had been saying, a police officer was immediately sent to the address of 4 Trow Road. Upon arrival, the officer briefly searched the exterior of the home while waiting for the other squadrons to show. Before he was able to make a full circle of the property, he noticed a slight movement out of the corner of his eye, coming from inside of the house. Inching closer to the home, he peered through a kitchen window, where he located a vague image. Someone appeared to be hiding behind the counter. Locking eyes with the petrified little girl, the officer was overcome with a wave of horror at what was before him. The girl was lying on the floor, her entire body coated in blood, and a portion of her foot had been severed. Someone had maimed the vulnerable child. Breaking down the front door, the officer finally gained entry inside, where he found the little girl, shaking and paralyzed by fear. Horrifyingly, she was attempting to scream and yell. However, nothing was coming out. When she could finally speak, she quickly gave her name, Jamie. The officer immediately carried Jamie outside, where he asked if any other people were in the house. She responded by saying that only her mother was in the bedroom. However, in a heartbreaking plea, she begged him not to leave her side. The officer comforted the young girl, stating that he needed to search the residence for anyone who may be hurt, and promised that she was safe. Just outside, another officer made their way to the petrified Jamie, where they could see that not only had her foot been severed, but she had suffered multiple lacerations to her head, legs, arms, and torso. When asked how she received the injuries, she responded by saying, "Some guy had a knife and another one had a bat and he hit my mom." Horrified, the officer asked if Jamie had any idea of who the perpetrators were, and although she couldn't identify any of her attackers, she recalled that one had been bald. However, she also told the authorities. One of them said, "Get the jewelry." She then told the police that she survived by pretending that she was dead. Soon, additional help had arrived, and it was then that they discovered all of the appalling contents waiting within the home. Authorities were able to follow the blood-stained footprints across the hallway carpet that led all the way back to the master bedroom. What they found upon entry could only be described as a chamber of horror. Not a single member of law enforcement could fathom the massive amounts of blood that had encompassed almost every inch of the room. And then they found something even more disturbing. The officers could barely stomach the absolute atrocity that was before them. Lying on the blood-soaked bed was Jamie's mother, Kimberly, who had been savagely murdered. Severely wounded Jamie was immediately rushed to the hospital, but there was no telling whether she would survive. Following the sickening discovery, the authorities were left with a mountain of questions. Most importantly, they needed to uncover who had unleashed such an evil attack upon a mother and her child. In an attempt to establish the motive, they began to search the house, and they discovered that various items of jewelry had been taken. In addition, they found that the basement window had been broken into, with the screen laying neatly on the ground. Along with this, the air conditioning unit that had been placed in a window above the deck was missing, yet another potential entry point to the home. South of the residence, tire tracks could be seen along the dirt pathway, and foot imprints were located within the front yard. As word of the brutal attack spread, the tight-knit community was plagued with fear. But what became even more frightening was the haunting whispers making their way to Mount Vernon from the nearby town of Brookline, only 20 minutes away. Apparently, a resident had been visiting a friend's house on Sunday, October 4th, and was introduced to a pair of young men, also from Brookline. Initially, the gathering seemed to be a harmless occasion, but that would quickly take a dark and unexpected turn. Within a short amount of time, the new friends had divulged a sick and twisted secret. They claimed that they had just killed a mother and her child, while another set of friends watched. The other patrons sat in disbelief as they listened to what they thought had been a scare tactic from the two, or a cruel joke. But as you'll come to find out, the truth behind this harrowing case would only emerge after a series of horrific findings. It's possible that the high of committing the crime had worn off, so the assailants were attempting to relive the attack and experience that rush again by describing it to friends. They likely enjoyed the attention and shock from the others, and were potentially confident that there was no evidence linking them to the crime, suggesting that they may have believed that they were smarter than police. However, they weren't smart enough as authorities caught wind of the chilling rumors, and were in a mad dash to track down the mysterious young men. They would turn out to be 19-year-old Christopher Gribble and 17-year-old Stephen Spader. One day after the horrific crime, they were each brought in for questioning. It was rather odd that Christopher, of all people, had been asked to talk with the police, considering his background. A longtime Eagle Scout, Christopher was a proud member of the Mormon Church and was working towards his goal of becoming a missionary. He'd been homeschooled from an early age, where his parents worked tirelessly to instill the proper values. This had also coincided with Christopher's time in the Boy Scouts, where he'd given back to his community, supposedly building a shed for the Brookline transfer station, a drop-off site for waste and recyclables. Although things weren't always as picture-perfect as they seemed. It was no secret that Christopher had struggled with the social portion of his life, where making friends became an almost impossible task. The few that he did have recalled his awkward demeanor and tendency to ramble during conversation. On top of this, social cues were somewhat of a foreign concept to the Eagle Scout, making for a rather difficult childhood. Human beings have a fundamental need to connect with other people. When someone is unable to or has great difficulty forming